Main event of the evening.
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing the third episode of Season 2 of the Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, Time Schlep.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in Time Schlep.
The time machine is running like new thanks to Fonzie's mechanic skills. Surely, this will be the trip that brings them back to 1957 Milwaukee.
They sure hope to get back to 1957 Milwaukee.
Cupcake isn't so sure. To get to their destination, they have to get past the Bermuda Triangle. And sure enough, within the triangle, a creepy man called Dr. Solo gloats that another ship has fallen into the time storm.
Another one, Lancelot! Another ship has fallen into the Bermuda time storm!
Yes, Dr. Solo.
And soon, their riches will belong to him. Accompanied by his robot, Lancelot, they go out onto a flying disc to find the crashed vessel. The time machine has crashed alongside a Viking ship, a submarine, a Spanish galleon, a biplane, and a rocket.
Terrible time warps!
Things have been dropping in here for centuries. I'm not sure I like the looks of this.
And then a giant gorilla shows up and picks up Ralph and Mr. Cool. Cupcake's zap does not help, only encasing her, Fonzie, and Richie in a sandcastle. However, a girl in a Victorian-style dress calls for Mongo to put Ralph and Mr. Cool down, which he does. She and Mongo then depart.
Beautiful lady! What is your name there?
Come, Mongo!
What a funny name that is.
Fonzie wants to find her, much to Cupcake's annoyance. Maybe she can tell them where they are. Fonzie and Mr. Cool manage to find the mismatched duo. She introduces herself as Eula, and says she was shipwrecked here in 1857. Mongo rescued her, and has protected her ever since. She hasn't aged because time stands still in the Bermuda Triangle.
Oh, you mean like shifting into neutral, right? I could dig that.
She and Fonzie have taken an immediate liking to each other, and Mongo has taken an immediate liking to Mr. Cool. Back at the time machine, Cupcake is having no luck making repairs. Richie says Fonzie could probably fix it, so a desperate Ralph runs out of the ship yelling for him.
Fonzie! Where are you?
Ralph, come back! You're never gonna find him out there!
He runs into Dr. Solo and Lancelot. The mad scientist orders Ralph captured, and Lancelot zaps a nearby rock with a finger beam, disintegrating it. Terrified, Ralph flees. He runs into Richie and Cupcake, but Dr. Solo finds them and zaps them with a beam of his own, encasing them in a big yellow bubble. As he flies them back to his lair, he says unless they tell him where the time machine is, they're never getting off this island.
I've got a bad feeling about this guy.
And you're a great judge of character, Cupcake. But if it gets us out of here, I'll tell.
Eula and Mongo bring Fonzie and Mr. Cool to their home, a house full of relics from various time periods. She says she shares it with a scientist from 1820, and the first to be captured by the time storm, Dr. Solo. She doesn't quite trust him, but she's safe with Mongo to protect her. The balcony has a great view of the time storm, which looks like a big funnel.
You'd be wise to avoid it. Anyone caught in it is tossed into other times, other places.
I know the feeling.
Dr. Solo imprisons Richie, Ralph, and Cupcake in his basement jail because they won't tell him where the time machine is. He bumps into Eula, who takes him to meet Fonzie. Dr. Solo suggests that Fonzie take him to the time machine so they can pick up his friends via flying disc. They find the time machine in bad shape. Dr. Solo suggests that they bring it back to his lab, and Fonzie can fix it there.
I'll fix it up there, then I'll bring it back here.
But as they fly back, Dr. Solo launches Fonzie and Mr. Cool from the flying disc, straight towards the time storm. However, Fonzie is able to use his jacket as a hang glider, and fly safely to the ground. They find a convenient broken-down motorcycle and 2 helmets.
Oh boy, a zoom!
Yeah, right. This zoom is a sight for sore eyes, I gotta tell you.
Back in Dr. Solo's basement jail, Lancelot begins working on the ship in front of the imprisoned gang. As Dr. Solo gloats about being able to return home, Eula interrupts him to ask where Fonzie is. Dr. Solo claims he and his friends left in the time machine. Eula returns to Mongo, and the two weep over never seeing him and Mr. Cool again.
They left, Mongo?
However, Fonzie got the motorcycle working, and he and Mr. Cool reunite with Eula and Mongo. In the basement, the time machine has been repaired, and Lancelot begins loading Dr. Solo's treasures. Mr. Cool sneaks into the basement, much to the rest of the gang's happiness.
That means Fonzie can't be far behind.
We're saved!
As Lancelot fires his finger beams at Mr. Cool, the dog manages to steal the ship's chronoscope, making it unable to leave. Mongo cracks open the mountain above the basement, carrying out Richie, Ralph, Cupcake, Mr. Cool, and the chronoscope. Dr. Solo vows to get the part back. Mongo carries Richie, Ralph, and Cupcake to safety, while Fonzie twists Lancelot's head around so he can't aim his finger beams. He, Eula, and Mr. Cool speed away on the motorcycle, while Dr. Solo tricks Mongo into chasing after them by claiming they're stealing the dog away from him.
You like that dog, don't you, Mongo? Yeah. Well, they're stealing him from you. They don't want you to see him ever again.
The gang reunites in a cave, cornered by Mongo and the watching Dr. Solo and Lancelot. Fonzie manages to sneak out of the cave through a crack in the ceiling and hijack the flying disc. However, he's grabbed by Mongo, so Mr. Cool runs out to distract him. Fonzie faces off with Dr. Solo and Lancelot. By dodging Lancelot's finger beam, he causes the robot to hit and disintegrate himself. Dr. Solo is tripped into his flying disc, which carries him away into the time storm. Everyone cheers for Fonzie, and Mongo accidentally squishes Mr. Cool.
Hey, as Richie always says, look on the bright side. You make a superior kite.
Thank you, Peter. That was Time Schlep. It first aired on September 26, 1981. The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang was followed by the Richie Rich Scooby-Doo Show. This week, Scooby and his pals visit Atlantis.
Atlantis!
CBS aired the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Show.
I started out as Roadrunner.
Meep. You mean meep meep?
No, they only paid me to say it once, then they doubled it up on the soundtrack. Cheap bastards.
And NBC had a new episode of The Smurfs. This week, the Smurfs find a meanie genie who won't grant them their wishes until they say the magic word. So, Peter, of those three choices, what are you watching?
I'm intrigued by the meanie genie.
I am too, and I'm wondering why the Smurfs feel entitled to have their wishes granted. They just met this guy, and all of a sudden he's mean because he won't immediately do what they say.
Yeah, Team Meanie Genie.
Time Schlep was directed by Ray Patterson, George Gordon, and Rudy Zamora. It was written by Dwayne Poole and Tom Swale. As for guest stars this week, I want to point out Renee Auberjonois as Dr. Solo.
More riches for me and doom for them.
Renee was an actor from New York who worked extensively in film and TV from the 1960s to the 2010s. He is arguably best remembered for his recurring roles as Clayton Endicott III on Benson.
You've got to be more aggressive with these people. You got to remember they're public servants and treat them like servants.
And as Odo on Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Stardate 46235.7, Ferengi privateers led by Damon Lurin boarded and seized control of the Enterprise using 2 salvaged Klingon birds of prey.
But his resume goes way beyond that. He was a Tony-winning stage actor with roles in Coco, The Good Doctor, and Big River. He was also a regular in the films of director Robert Altman, appearing in MASH, Brewster McCloud, The Player, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller. His other movies include Petulia, The Patriot, The Eyes of Laura Mars, and the 1976 remake of King Kong, very appropriate for this episode. He was also a prolific voice actor whose credits include Disney's The Little Mermaid and such series as
The Smurfs, Batman the Animated Series, Archer, Duck Dodgers, Rugrats, DuckTales, Snorks, Super Friends, and so much more.
He died in 2019 at the age of 79. Peter, were you familiar with Renee Auberjonois outside of this episode?
Yes, I very much was. I think the first place I heard him was Disney's The Little Mermaid, which you mentioned, and I do still need to get around to seeing Deep Space Nine. One of our late dogs was a greyhound that we named Odo, after his character from Deep Space Nine.
When I think of Renee Auberjonois, the first thing I think of is Benson, but I also remember him as Desaad on Super Friends.
Yes.
And do you know who was Darkseid?
Frank Welker.
Desaad, you assured me they could not escape from the mind probe.
But Darkseid.
As for cultural and historical references this week, if the title, Time Schlep, is supposed to be a pun on something, I don't get it. But Schlep is a Yiddishism meaning a tedious journey. As a verb, it means to lug something heavy or awkward around.
He came from the old bar mitzvah spread, schlepping a salami and pumpernickel bread.
What are they schlepping?
The time machine, I guess. It does kind of get traded from person to person in this episode.
This episode takes place in the Bermuda Triangle. This is a region off the coast of Florida in the Atlantic Ocean where both ships and airplanes are said to disappear mysteriously.
You know what's going on that Bermuda Triangle? Down the Bermuda Triangle. Elvis needs boats. Elvis needs boats. Elvis, 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 Elvis needs boats.
This was mainly a mid-20th century phenomenon and can be traced back to a 1950 article in the Miami Herald. In fact, this area is no more prone to disappearances than anywhere else, so the legend has largely been debunked. However, for decades, people tried to explain it as a paranormal phenomenon. Since the Bermuda Triangle isn't talked about as much, do people still instantly recognize that term and know what it means?
Yeah, they do. Even if it's not as common as it once was, it is one of those things that's settled in as a permanent trope.
Does this episode even take place in a particular year, or are they outside of time?
They're like outside of time. I actually did like that a lot about this episode. It felt simultaneously wildly imaginative and undercooked. This episode brings up a lot of really interesting ideas that they can't go into because of the nature of this as a half-hour, generally continuity-free show.
This episode raises so many questions, which we will get to as we get further into the plot. Dr. Solo's robotic henchman is named Lancelot. Presumably, this is a reference to the character from Arthurian legend, often depicted wearing a full-body suit of armor.
Sir Lancelot, the boldest and most expensive of the knights,
When they actually did a King Arthur episode, Lancelot was not in it, but when they did a Bermuda Triangle episode, Lancelot is in it, and he's evil.
I assume that Lancelot is from the distant future, and he also ended up in the Bermuda Triangle via the time storm, because otherwise that means that this scientist from the 19th century built a working robot that takes directions and follows orders and can fix a time machine on its own.
Well, Dr. Solo does appear to be a pretty clever guy. Maybe he built him, I don't know. It's also possible that Lancelot is one of those refugees from another time period. Mongo is an obvious parody of King Kong. If the connection weren't clear, Fonzie even calls him King Kong at one point.
I think King Kong here has a crush on you. Must be like your animal magnetism.
Kong's career was in a bit of a slump in 1981. He hadn't had a movie for 5 years and wouldn't have another for 5 more. Mongo is an example of how weird this episode is. There are no rules for a Bermuda Triangle story, so do we want to have a robot knight and a giant gorilla in it? Sure, we can just have anything because we're just making this up as it goes.
I have questions about Mongo. Is he a species indigenous to the area, or was he also a time storm refugee?
I hadn't even thought about that. He was probably native to that island? I don't know. Fonzie says that Dr. Solo's hovercraft looks like the hubcap of a 53 pickup. He's likely referring to the 1953 pickup trucks produced by the Chevrolet division of General Motors. It appears that Dr. Solo has looted art treasures from various centuries. We see Discobolus, an ancient Greek statue by Myron dating back to around 450 BC and depicting an athlete throwing a discus. We also see a slightly happier version of Da Vinci's painting The Mona Lisa from the early 1500s, plus a self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh from 1889, and a bust of Nefertiti from 1345 BC. Did you notice anything else among his treasures that he's collected?
I was primarily distracted by the Mona Lisa. Like you mentioned, this is a much happier one. Instead of the iconic, quiet, secretive smile, she's got like this big old grin.
I was thinking that maybe this was the first draft of the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, maybe. We've got the current version and he's got an earlier one.
Mona Lisa, men have named you.
Where did he get all of this artwork? Was he an art thief when he was traveling in 1820 and ended up in the Bermuda Triangle? Or was this stuff all being transported over the Bermuda Triangle at some point?
The second is my assumption. This stuff was all being transported and they just happened to crash at the Bermuda Triangle and then he stole it.
You'd think they would have been more careful.
It raises all kinds of questions about the many people who must have been aboard these various vehicles and what really happened to them. Fonzie says,
"Oh, now that's an offer I can't refuse."
This is a reference to a quote that originally appeared in Mario Puzo's 1969 novel, The Godfather, and then in the Oscar-winning 1971 film adaptation of The Godfather.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
I have no idea how Fonzie knows it, but again, he may be having adventures that we don't get to see.
Yes, off camera, they saw Bye Bye Birdie, and they saw or possibly read The Godfather.
Fonzie refers to Lancelot as Tin Man. Presumably, he's referring to the Tin Woodsman, who first appeared in L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900, and then was portrayed by Jack Haley in 1939.
Why, it's a man. A man made out of tin.
Other observations this week, we get another brand new intro by Henry Winkler. This one starts with,
"Hey, listen up and be cool."
It also contains perhaps the first ever use of the word pronto mundo.
There's some high adventure coming your way, pronto mundo.
So I like the innovation of that moment. Is Dr. Solo supposed to be wearing a monocle? If not, what is up with his eyes?
You got funny eyes.
I think he's just got one bad eye. He's from the 19th century, and he's been stranded in the Bermuda Triangle for God knows how long. He does not have access to good health care.
At one point, Ralph says, "Richie, old pal, old friend, and Cupcake."
Richie, old pal, old friend, and Cupcake.
Which is subtle but devastating.
She has stranded them in time with seemingly no way of getting home within the foreseeable future. I think it's a little bit fair that he's mad at her.
So have Dr. Solo and Eula been living together for decades by this point? What has their daily life been like?
This episode raises so many questions that it does not have the time to answer. She does mention that Mongo has been protecting her, so I assume that if any other travelers have come through, that Dr. Solo has just been murdering them, and he just can't do that to Eula because, giant gorilla friend. I feel like this could almost be the premise for a show of its own. These two people in this isolated, spooky area, and they have to find a way to live together while also being at odds. Kind of like a Gilligan's Island by way of Lost in Space thing.
And now there are no other humans on this island other than Eula herself. And she says, now it's truly a tropical paradise or something.
Now this island really is a paradise.
I'm like, you are on a path to madness. There's only a gorilla here now. There are no other humans. At least you had someone.
The gorilla betrayed her because he thought that a dog was going to leave. A dog that he just met.
Yes, he was very easily convinced to turn against her. I don't know what her life is going to be like. I think that they almost are obligated to check back in with her occasionally just to do a wellness check on Eula. Richie gets to say bucko again this week.
Okay, bucko.
But Ralph says, even under pressure, the mouth mind is still sharp.
Amazing. Even under pressure, the mouth mind is still sharp.
Which is a very wordy way of saying, I still got it. I was like, just say the phrase that we're all waiting for.
Just do the line.
Maybe the writers of this show don't actually know Ralph's catchphrase. We should be glad that they at least know bucko.
Yes.
Because I'm not 100% convinced that Dwayne Poole and Tom Swale watched Happy Days all that much. Do you think Fonzie inadvertently unleashed Dr. Solo on another time period, ruining the lives of other people in the process?
Entirely likely, yes. If the show had gotten a third season, I think that should have been a follow-up episode. The Return of Dr. Solo.
You're not really solving the problem. You're just sort of kicking the can further down the road. Okay, chuck this guy into the time storm. Somebody else is going to have to deal with him now.
Are you saying that they should have killed Dr. Solo?
I guess yes. I don't know. This episode also made me realize that there is another episode that the Fonz and the Happy Days gang eventually should have done. What if the time machine arrives in the 25th century?
Oh, we could meet Cupcake's family and friends and see what her life is like when she's not traveling through time.
And as far as Cupcake is concerned, she is home. Her journey would have come to an end. So then what happens to Richie, Ralph, and Fonzie? Does she just give them the time machine or what? Because once she gets back home, she's not going to want to get back on that time machine and get lost again. That would be a really interesting dilemma for an episode. And I would love to see how that scenario would play out. I guess we didn't get Fonz and the Happy Days Gang Season 3. As for things Cupcake says this week, she has some new ones.
Terrible time warps, perilous plutons, creeping cosmos, leaping laser beams, cosmic comets, and sizzling sunspots.
Did you notice a phrase that was not on that list?
I believe I did, yes.
This is, I think, the first episode where she does not say moon craters. So how is Mr. Cool this week? There are some times when Mr. Cool makes things better. He accidentally finds a motorcycle for Fonzie. He successfully retrieves the chronoscope and risks his own safety in the process. And with a little prompting, he agrees to distract Mongo to save Fonzie. Times when Mr. Cool makes things worse? None this week that I could see. So way to go, Mr. Cool. You didn't mess up anything. You didn't betray anyone. Here are the times when Mr. Cool suffers physically and mentally. A panel falls off the time machine and hits him on the head. After he stumbles into the dungeon, Lancelot zaps him multiple times with laser beams. Mongo repeatedly grabs him, squeezes him, and pets him, much to Mr. Cool's dismay. Mongo also repeatedly drops him. Mongo even squishes him flat once. Mongo plays a little too rough. Do you think their relationship is inspired a little bit by Of Mice and Men or those Looney Tunes that were sort of inspired by Mice and Men?
Just what I always wanted, my own little bunny rabbit. I will name him George, and I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him.
I feel like both, definitely.
Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in Time Schlep?
I really loved Eula's dress. It's this classic high-collar Victorian dress, because, you know, she's from the 19th century. It's a very pretty shade of blue. It's in very good shape considering that she's been in the Bermuda Triangle for God knows how long. I would have thought she would go for something a bit more casual, but if it's all she has, maybe it makes sense. And she's also got the classic corkscrew curls hairstyle a lot of girls had at the time, which I also really liked. I thought it made a fun visual contrast with Mongo because, again, he's a giant gorilla, and then you have her in this very proper type outfit.
I was very impressed with how Eula kept up her look and the fact that she must keep doing her hair every day.
That's the kind of hairstyle that takes a lot of time and effort.
And she's obviously doing it, but I guess what else does she have to do all day? Maybe she has time to work on her hair a lot. Now, do you think, given some of his inventions and his general way of being, that there is something vaguely steampunkish about Dr. Solo?
Yeah, definitely. It's very, very subtle, but he is from the 19th century, and he has a robot henchman, a hovercraft, and a tractor beam. He's straddling the line between steampunk and ray gun gothic.
Did you have any other observations that you wanted to make about Time Schlep?
It was really weird to me that Mongo turned on Eula and the others just because Dr. Solo basically told him so. I don't know how intelligent he is. He seems approximately sentient. He's capable of following complex-ish directions from Eula, and I guess also Dr. Solo. I kind of had the impression that he was on Eula's side, and he just turned on her. What the heck?
He just takes Dr. Solo at his word, and then immediately assumes that Fonzie and the gang are his enemies. So it doesn't take much to convince Mongo. At least now, Eula will just be alone on the island, and there won't be anybody to tell Mongo anything different, but she'd better hope nobody else shows up and even says a sentence to Mongo, because Mongo's mind can be changed very, very easily.
I feel like the gang would pretty much have to take Eula anywhere that is not the Bermuda Triangle. Does she want to live out the rest of her days as an unchanging immortal with nobody to talk to? Like you said, that is a recipe for madness.
I think that's the ending that she's been set up for. I think that's what they're implying here, is that she and Mongo are just going to live alone on this island forever. At least she has a nice house.
I feel like this should have been like a two-parter, and part two should have been about them taking Eula back to her time period. But on the other hand, then what do they do with Mongo? He can't fit in the time machine. Is he just going to have to stay in the Bermuda Triangle forever? Wait, Cupcake has shown the power to shrink things before. Maybe she could shrink Mongo just enough to get him into the ship. Granted, that might be a little bit too much for her, but she could try.
Obviously, this episode needed a follow-up because one episode was not nearly enough to cover this story. So, Peter, I will ask that age-old timeless question. Was this episode any good?
As I said earlier, this episode is both wildly imaginative and underbaked. It introduces a lot of really interesting concepts, but it can't really focus on those concepts. It raises a lot of questions that it just can't answer.
This episode was fascinating to me and frustrating because we are figuratively and literally in uncharted territory here. This is not any particular historical time period. This is not any particular fictional genre that I know of. Whatever this is, there's no precedent. So how it works, I have no idea. And what are the rules here? I would applaud the writers for coming up with something original, but it's an unfinished story. There's really so much to tell here. So this really needed to be a series all of its own. I was glad to get a little bit of this world in this one episode, and I wonder if Fonz and the gang will be haunted by dreams of Eula and Mongo for the rest of their journey.
I think they will. I think that they're going to have PTSD for the rest of their lives. When you go back to watching regular live-action Happy Days, you have to remember that at one point, Richie and Ralph and Fonzie were in the Bermuda Triangle, and they met a giant gorilla and a girl, and they just left them there to live out the rest of their days.
Do you remember in Welcome Home when Richie says he has all kinds of ideas for movies? This is where he got them, Peter!
Oh my god.
It's because he remembers all these adventures that he had. Okay, so now I feel more confident for Richie's success in Hollywood because I know he has a bunch of stories he can tell. So that ties it into the main Happy Days universe.
Of course.
And now for something completely different.
So Henry Winkler was a guest on Bill Maher's podcast on September 12th. The subject matter ended up turning to Israel's current invasion of Gaza. It was honestly a very heartening watch. He mentions that Netanyahu should be in jail for furthering this absolute massacre. He talks about the fact that, well, Maher may be saying that the Israeli army isn't actively trying to kill civilians, but if you look at the footage, it sure does seem that they don't really care about not doing that. I bring this up just because back in November of last year, I believe, I was very shaken by what was going on, and I thought, well, we should use our platform to just say something, and we tied it back to the fact that Winkler had been on an Israeli television show in the early 2020s, and I sort of regret that because I don't think we should have mentioned that at all, just because I'm afraid that it came across as like blaming him for that, and I don't think that he should have done it, but I don't think that was the biggest problem with what is going on, and I was very heartened to see him just making these very good points about how this has to stop. They can't kill everyone in Gaza and say that they're doing it to fight terrorism. The 10-minute or so clip of this specific discussion is available on YouTube. It's kind of surprising that Maher put it out there because it does not make him look good, but if Bill Maher was self-aware about not looking like a jackass, he simply would not be Bill Maher.
So, Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things that we are doing?
Listeners can follow me on Blue Sky at petervolfrank.bsky.social.
And they can follow me on Blue Sky at joeblevins.bsky.social. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysaroours.libsyn.com, and they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysaroourspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Well, this episode may not have been tied to any specific genre or story, but next episode is going to correct that, because the Fonz and the Happy Days gang are going to the center of the earth, just like Jules Verne, in It's All Downhill From Here.
Oh, that sounds very exciting. So see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
A hungry feeling came o'er me stealing. All the mice were squealing in my prison cell. and the old triangle. When jingle, jangle, all along the banks of the Royal Canal.
Cheap bastards.